Yes, I want to welcome everyone from various places. It's interesting that we have this capacity that we're all learning about. At least I am. This technology to enable us to do this kind of thing. Um, we have some interesting things to confront. The reality of this shutdown has altered all of our lives, and then we have to anticipate what it's going to look like when we begin to emerge from our various caves all over the world. And in order to handle that from a very personal business point of view, legal point of view, and an economic point of view, as well as an overall moral vantage point, which brings us to the mission of the Acton Institute, we've assembled what I think are a group of pretty good people here. Let me just say at the outset that as we're going along, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, please use your Q&A feature or the chat feature. And the folks behind the scenes who are kind of orchestrating this will be able to facilitate your question and get it to us. Let me just tell you also, at the end, we're going to offer you, if you just send us your information, some books that we're making available. The Call of the Entrepreneur, which will be made available in English, or if we have anyone watching from Italy, we also have La Vocazione Imprenditoriale. So let us know what language you want that in. Let me introduce now the participants that we have. First of all, we have Mr. Bob Luddy, who is a businessman who, like many business people in our country right now, has been impacted by this. He is the CEO of CaptiveAire, and it's based in North Carolina, nation's leading manufacturer of commercial kitchen ventilation systems. We also have Judge Joseph Scoville, who's a very good friend of Acton for many years. He served for 26 years as United States Magistrate Judge for the Western District of Michigan. He's moderated and hosted many of our events over the years. And Dr. Stephen Barrows, who is the Managing Director of Programs at the Acton Institute and is a professor, a doctor of economics as well. So we've got the bases covered. And Bob Luddy, I'd like to start with you. I should mention also that Bob is the author of this terrific book, Entrepreneurial Life. He's lived it, he's living it. And so what he speaks about today comes from not an abstract idea, but a real lived life. Bob, tell us a little bit first about your company and how many employees you have, and of course, how you've been affected by these shutdowns.
Well, CaptiveAire is an unusual company in that we started up in 1976 with no seed capital, and I was the first employee, obviously, and it's grown over the years. So in spite of the fact that we were grossly undercapitalized, eventually over time, we became a technology company. We have the leading technologies in the world on commercial kitchen ventilation, controls, pollution control equipment. We currently employ 1,450 individuals in 100 sales offices in the US, 7 manufacturing plants. Additionally, we operate some schools, as you're aware, Father, that employ another 400 people. So we're pushing toward 2,000 employees. And as you would suspect, the impact is very strong.
Yeah. How have you just kind of experienced the initial phases of this shutdown in terms of your employees? What's gone on a practical level? Is everyone not working at this point?
About 80% of our employees are working. Some have been furloughed. Some employees are working 3 and 4 days a week because while there may be orders due to these shutdowns, those orders can't be shipped because job sites are shut down. So and one thing that I learned in conducting interviews and from our own employees, almost universally, there's some exceptions. They want to work because we love the work we do, we contribute, it's what we do every day. And when you take that away from somebody, it's like taking a football player off the field. It doesn't feel good. And skills erode quickly. It takes tremendous teams of individuals to run manufacturing plants. And even under the best of conditions, they're challenging. When you slow down or shut them down, you're degrading the capabilities of the organization. So it doesn't feel good to anybody. And from an economic standpoint, we have no debt. We're a very strong financial company. But no company can pay out expenses indefinitely with no revenue or greatly reduced revenue. And it seems like
Sure.
that's not well understood by our policymakers.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think of is the reality that the effect personally on people's their morale, their spirituality, their psychological well-being. I mean, I'm seeing this as a pastor. It's not just this economic exchange that you can move off the table and think everything's going to be the same. It's a three-dimensional reality that people are facing.
Yeah, Daniel Henninger in the Wall Street Journal used the term economic suicide. So
Yeah.
for the first time in the history of America, we have shut down our enterprises. And there's a lot of talk continuously about national security. The best national security is a strong economy with highly skilled individuals ready to meet whatever challenges come up. And when we start tearing these things apart, shutting them down, they don't restart very easily. Not well understood by some economists and financial people on Wall Street. So as we get a couple of months down the line here, I don't think we're going to be talking very much about COVID, but we're going to be talking a lot about the economy, loss of jobs. It was announced today there's over 26 million people newly unemployed, and that's more jobs than were created over the last 12 years. So we've just wiped out 12 years of growth in our economy.
You know, I said at the beginning that you are a man who is a practical man who has his hands really in the midst of work, but you're also an intellectual. I mean, you're very familiar with Austrian economics. Tell us something a little about what forms your economic approach to your enterprise.
Well, I would say both from I think of the Catholic religion and Austrian economics as being very congruent in that they understand human nature, and the policies and ideas they have are trying to control our worst instincts. So Austrian economics is, it's not predictive, as you know, but it says if you do the right things, just if you do in a moral way, over time you will have good outcomes. And I found that Austrian economics, many laws which had been initially started in the University of Salamanca 500 years ago, whether it's supply and demand, transactional costs, opportunity costs, these come into play every day. And I've taught our engineers and had them go to seminars, so they have a very good understanding of free market economics. And that's a huge part of the success of our company.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Very interesting. We should do a whole interview just on that. This has had a real legal impact. I mean, there's a lot of legal questions. There's even been now some lawsuits being brought. I know that here in Michigan, Judge Scoville, you're right here in Michigan. Give us a kind of context of the legal challenges. We hear both on the part of the president and, as an example, the governor of Michigan, asserting different claims over what they are responsible for, what power they have. Could you kind of give us an orientation to that question?
Sure. Good afternoon, Father, and good afternoon to everyone out there who's listening. The short answer to your question is that the principal power is in the states. In our federalist system, The federal government only has such powers as are specifically delegated to it by the Constitution. All other powers are reserved in the states. Now, the president himself has virtually no domestic power given to him in the Constitution. All his power is given to him by statute. So Congress must exercise one of its enumerated powers and then give the president the power to execute that law. Now, in the case of health, safety, the public health, most of the power is in the states. And this has been understood since the beginning of the country. There's an old case from 1824 written by Chief Justice John Marshall. This case is called Gibbons versus Ogden. It's read by first-year law students everywhere. And the Supreme Court said that quarantine laws and health and safety laws of every kind are the subject of the state's power, not the federal government's power. So the states have the authority really to regulate life in order to make sure that people are safe. And the president really has not been given any power by Congress to do this. That is why, in my opinion, he didn't try to shut down the economy. He's always said it's up to the governors because he understands he doesn't have the authority either under the Constitution or as granted by Congress. Now, there are some legitimate sources of federal authority here. For example, the president exercising power that Congress gave him in the past, cut off travel from China and other places. That power comes from the Commerce Clause, where the federal government has the power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. But beyond that, the power really inheres in the states. So the states were the ones who shut down the economy. The president really did nothing. He issued guidelines, but he has done nothing to shut down the economy. The state governors did it, and now it's up to the state governors to relieve those restrictions.
So what about the lawsuits that are presently being brought against various governors? How would that work its way through the courts?
Well, each lawsuit is different. It's sort of hard to opine on them all since I haven't seen any of them. But I'll take an example, Michigan. The governor of Michigan has no constitutional authority in emergencies under the Michigan Constitution, but he or she has tremendous statutory power. There's a 1945 law that was passed when the confidence in government was at the highest in our country after the Depression and World War II. This statute is one paragraph long. It gives the governor the power to declare an emergency and then to issue whatever reasonable regulations he may deem appropriate to protect life and property, period. No limitations, no legislative check at all, and no time limit. So our governor has exercised her power under this 1945 law. There's a later law in 1976 that is more limited and gives the legislature power to shut down the time of emergency after 28 days. The legislature chose a while ago to extend that. But she has all the powers she needs under the earlier unlimited 1945 law. And she hasn't exercised all her power yet because Michigan law gives her the power to declare martial law, to send in the National Guard and declare martial law or rule in any county. So unfortunately, the state legislatures have given the governors tremendous power, and power once given is very hard to take back. So in my opinion, these lawsuits don't have much of a chance. Yes, Father.
No, I was going to say we'll come back to this both on a business level, on an economic level, about what the consequences of this may be. Let me bring in Dr. Barrows for a moment here. This, of course, obviously has terrific economic dimension. What do you see the effects of this potentially being? I mean, what is going to happen in terms of our presumption of the role of government, particularly with regard to the Fed and the printing of money? And then we can get into down the road consequences having to do with inflation.
Sure. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Father, for the question. And I really think it can be summarized, and was summarized well by Mr. Luddy, about the decline in productive economic activity and its impact on individual workers. You know, individuals are out there ordinarily taking their gifts and talents into the marketplace and being productive and providing services to others. And so as you see this kind of economic decline, where there's individuals that are told to stay down under lockdown and only its so-called essential services are allowed to continue, is absolutely disruptive. And I think the most important thing to point out is that when the government steps in to try to intervene, it's understandable why they would want to intervene in terms of, you know, stopping and flattening the curve and making sure they respond to the epidemiological concerns that are out there. But other things like fiat paychecks and printing of money never replaces true economic productivity. It just becomes by fiat. And so if an individual receives a paycheck, that may be of some value to them from a humanitarian standpoint, but in the end, those productive activities are not returning. And so, as we navigate this space and balance those epidemiological risks with the economic risks, in the end, we have to figure out how to enable people to get back to work. So that's Bob, the gist of the concern.
Yeah, Bob, you did an interview with The Spectator, in which you made reference to the dependence on health experts. Could you elaborate that point for our audience?
Yeah, you think about this, one person at the CDC, Dr. Fauci, is essentially created a hysteria and paranoia throughout the entire country. And it could be as simple, that's his opinion. And he's the so-called expert because he has a PhD and he's been around for a long time. But we know from any expert advice, we synthesize it, we think about it, and we put it into context. So while there may be dangers from COVID-19, there's many other dangers in the world. For example, many more people are going to die from heart attacks, cancer, and this idea that we are foregoing elective surgery. I don't know too many people that go into the hospital and say, I'd like to have some elective surgery this week. And go there because they have problems that need to be solved. So if you put off a cancer operation, a heart operation, people are going to die over these issues. So any senior executive would take all this information together and try to make a rational decision. And most of our governors have not done that. They've just blanketed, we're going to shut it down. We have counties in North Carolina that don't even have COVID, but they're shut down. Now, what kind of sense does that make?
You know, you make a very, go ahead, yes, please, Joe, come in.
I'm going to take off my judge hat and put on my government teacher hat. I've taught government in Father Sirico's high school for 3 years. And it seems to me that what we have here is the lack of exercise of political judgment. When you listen to our governor, for example, in Michigan, she says, I'm following the science and the best medical advice that we have. Well, if the only question were medical, then we wouldn't have to elect a governor. We would have a medical czar in chief, and they would tell us how to run our lives. They would probably say, don't get in the car because you have a very good chance of dying. And they might say, don't go to work because you can have an industrial accident. Certainly don't build a skyscraper, you might fall off. So if the only issue were medical, the world would look much different from the way it does now. And that's what Bob is talking about, I think, that we have a unidimensional approach and the governors are not exercising political judgment. Politics, according to Aristotle, is the highest science. Now, Aquinas would say theology is, but we live in a secular world. So politics is the highest science because it governs all of the others. Medical science, economic science, legal science. Politics is supposed to take all this into consideration and come up with a principled exercise of judgment. And that's what the politicians are not doing. They're not exercising political judgment. They're listening to a doctor who will, of course, give a medical judgment, but they're not taking into consideration all the other things that are necessary for the society, economy, and the world to work. So in my view, Mr. Luddy is absolutely right. We're taking a unilateral, unidimensional approach, and that's the whole problem.
And what makes this so dangerous is that when that unilateral perspective, the old saw, to a hammer everything is a nail, when that is combined with a presumption that the actor in society is the state, is the government, what you do is marginalize all of the other sources of information, all of the other competencies that exist within a society. In addition to medicine, in addition to science, there is the psychological dimension, there's the economic dimension, there's the work dimension, there's the spiritual dimension, because this comes into it when priests and ministers are prohibited from visiting patients in hospitals. So it really is a challenge of a kind of presumption that the central actor in society is the government. What happens to the economy when this kind of phenomenon makes its presence known? I'll ask Steve to comment on
Sure.
that from the perspective of economics, but also Bob as a businessman, what is happening.
Absolutely, and I agree completely with what Judge Scoville just pointed out, and it's also applicable to the way the government has approached this from an economic intervention standpoint. They've effectively traded speed for precision, and have just thrown money at the problem without really considering the implications for the long run of what spending money is going to do to the economy. And I think what we found is obviously there's been a surge of spending, trillions of dollars. I think approaching half of what the government budget would be during any ordinary year, just in response to what's transpired over the past month. Now, if you think about that, when you spend that kind of money, nobody's asking the question, how do you pay for it? They just by default say, well, we're sure the central bank is going to just accommodate this policy and soak up and purchase all of those newly issued treasuries to make sure that we go ahead and get the money out into the economy. And so as a result, you'll end up having an increase in the national debt. And the national debt, of course, is critical for long-run economic growth and making sure that you keep that under control. And at this point, the national debt does exceed the overall annual output of the entire U.S. economy. So when you think about that, and studies have shown, Kenneth Rogoff from Harvard University and Carmen Reinhart, they have demonstrated that historically, when governments and countries have national debts that exceed a certain level of their annual output, it creates a long-term drag on economic growth, which of course brings with it all sorts of negative side effects for human flourishing. In the end, as I alluded to previously, no amount of fiat money replaces actual productivity and interaction in the marketplace. And so we can paper it over, but it's never going to bring about results that you expect unless you get people back to employing their gifts and service in the marketplace. So it is a long-term concern for sure, and of course done very hastily. Again, in some cases, such as the purchasing of additional personal protective equipment or perhaps additional research for testing and so forth, those are certainly things that you would expect the government to jump in to facilitate. But all of these other sweeping spending opens the door for crony capitalism and rent seeking and all the other problems that come with just a spending binge like we've experienced.
Bob, can you give us that perspective from the business angle? What does that look like in terms of productivity, fiat money? How does that impact your life and the life of your employee?
One thing to consider is when production's lost, it can never be regained. So if we have 2 months lost production, it's never regained in our economy. Many economists are talking in Q2, the economy will decline by 20 to 35%. Now, to put that in perspective, if you went back to 08, 09, we thought we had a terrible recession, the worst since the Depression. The economy only declined by a few percent. And the recovery was slow, but at least we weren't going backwards. If you take a $22 trillion economy and slice 25% off it, we're getting into the range of where the Chinese economy is. And that's why I brought up this area of national security. You cannot shut down productive business for any reason. You figure out how to deal with the risks. So long term, companies are going to have less capital. They're going to be more reluctant to invest because now government can just slice their investment anytime they want. And there's states that you're familiar with. Would anybody want to invest in there when your business could be closed at any time by the governor? That's a very, very scary thought. So if we look at entrepreneurism in the future, you're going to see more risk aversion. And unless these laws are changed, we have severely and long-term impacted the U.S. economy. And what's even more frightening, and Dr. Barrows did a great job explaining this, but many economists don't seem to understand what he stated. And it seems like most of the financial community, including the stock exchange, do not remotely understand what's coming down.
This is, an incredibly important point, because a lot of people are wondering, what's the future going to be like? And this whole question that touches on politics, informed by economics and informed by the concrete life of people in business, is going to require for us to limit the power of governors, decentralize economic planning, decentralize the place from which we get our knowledge, and really kind of to go back to that whole principle of subsidiarity, which we've been banging the drum on since the founding of the Acton Institute, to allow needs to be met at the most local level of their existence. What does this look like in terms of the immediate future? How does one begin to back out of this just from the point of view of the regulations that are in place now? I know that the governor of Georgia has begun this process, not without criticism. How would that look to you, Bob, as a businessman? What would you do if you were free to do it tomorrow?
Well, two things to keep in mind. In a very rich economy, which we enjoyed up to February, there's many people who have marginal skills who are employed and making a reasonably good living. Those people will not be employed in the future economy because they're being permanently terminated. So it's not like they're ever going to come back to work. And to the extent they do come back to work, they're not going to have the income levels they had previously. So when you have these gigantic rifts, slowly individuals will be rehired. But, and this has been stated by many major companies, you're not going to be all rehired in 1 week. It's going to be a slow, arduous process. And as you get to the last third, or whatever the number comes out to be, they may never be rehired. So it's considered a furlough, but a lot of these furloughs are going to turn into permanent unemployment. And it's been stated often, and Father, you know this better than anybody, it's very hard to build and develop. It's very easy to destroy. And our governors have just indicated how fast they can destroy the best economy in the history of the world.
You know, if I could add to what Mr. Luddy said, I think what's interesting is during this time of relative emergency, the federal government has taken some steps to unravel or temporarily suspend certain kinds of regulations. So for example, my wife is a physician, and I know that certain kinds of requirements and expectations for remote telemedicine and the HIPAA laws have been temporarily suspended so that individuals can go ahead and provide the care and treatment that individuals and patients need. But the mere fact that the government has acknowledged this and has rolled back some of those is an acknowledgement there's an economic cost to that kind of regulatory apparatus. And so I think we need to be thinking through just how many of these regulations that have historically in place are proving to be very severe disruptors of economic growth and service to our fellow human beings. And so hopefully that will be a long run lesson out of this, that, you know what, much of the regulatory apparatus is too costly to keep in place.
You know, what this discussion is bringing to the fore is the necessity for the response to be a holistic response, so that it's not just one or two sectors and I think there's probably this silo effect that we've had. One group of people who have an interest in a thing may make a piece of legislation or advocate for a piece of legislation, but it needs to be done across the board. Legally, Judge Scoville, talk to us about all of this. How do we back out of this from a legal point of view?
Well, I would first start out by saying that we have dangers now that we didn't have a couple of months ago. And that stems from the fact that war and other emergency situations are our most dangerous time for liberty and the greatest time for expansion of government power. If you look back at our history, the Civil War and the Depression and World War II gave us the greatest permanent expansions of central power. That's because during war or other emergency, people want to be helped. They welcome the government's intervention. But once this power is granted, it's very hard to take away. So we have to understand that when Congress, for example, spends the way it does, as it did in 2008, 2009, it makes it easier for them to spend this time. There's a precedent. People go, well, let's have another stimulus. When the states exercise power to a dangerous level, as they have done now, they're used to it. People are used to it. And what's next? A climate change emergency? Is the governor going to say, well, there's too much economic activity, we're going to shut down every Friday and Monday so we don't have carbon in the air? So the first thing we have to do, I think, is to make sure that we're very aware of the new dangers that have arisen just because of this emergency.
And it's intriguing what you just said. Isn't embedded, I go back to Michigan because it's the thing I'm most familiar with. Isn't that climate emergency embedded in some of the regulations that Governor Whitmer has already instituted in terms of what you can buy and what you can't buy?
Absolutely. And when people say, for example, well, why can't landscapers work? They're outside. There's no way you're going to catch this disease outside on a riding mower. She says, well, those things use gasoline.
Right.
So what's she really saying there?
Right.
That we don't like people using gasoline because the internal combustion engine is inherently bad. So yes, the exercise of power, well, as you can see, Congress did it. The governors are doing it. It's an opportunity, right? Wasn't it Rahm Emanuel who said, don't let any emergency or disaster go to waste?
Any crisis. Right.
Don't let any crisis go to waste. And that's certainly what they're doing. So we have to understand that we're not at status quo when we come back. We're in the hole now. We've retrogressed with regard to the balance between government on the one hand and life on the other.
Right.
Could I add a comment, Father?
Yes, go right ahead, Bob.
There's a lot of talk about the U.S. resurgence of manufacturing, but all these laws and regulations and requirements have made it extremely difficult on manufacturers. Just getting a building permit, endless, both state, county regulation, endless taxation. China and other countries don't have those burdens. And I'll use the example, not a company I favor, but Tesla built a plant over there in 10 months. You couldn't build an automobile plant in the US in maybe 10 years, depending on where you were building it, because the environmentalists will be after you. Every state regulator will figure out why they don't want you to build the plant. So manufacturing is very, very hard, primarily because of government regulation. If that regulation were reduced, Americans work harder than anybody in the world. They're great people. They're very capable of producing better than any country in the world. And things like tariffs also hurt us. So if we want to buy a component, but we have to pay a tariff that China doesn't pay, we're at an economic disadvantage. And that's almost universal. If you want to pay tariffs on steel. There's a reason why we outsource around the world, and it's basic economics, which you're familiar with.
Can I ask Mr. Luddy a follow-up question in that area? Yesterday's Wall Street
Sure, go
Journal
ahead.
had an op-ed from a manufacturer who said that, and I believe it was a restaurant supply. He said he was able to fulfill some contracts. He's trying to get his people to come back to work. Nobody wants to work because they're making more money under enhanced unemployment than they were employed by him. He'd have to pay them $24 an hour to match what they're getting on unemployment. So what is the effect of this government intervention in not only production, but the wage area on the ability to ramp up quickly after these restrictions are gone?
Yeah, the wage push is going to be absolutely enormous. And the amount of money that government has pushed into this, and there were 4 senators that tried to preclude this from being in the law, but they got run over like bugs. So long term, this is going to be a real hard problem to work through, particularly as they elongate them. The only way I know to get through it is if someone's rifted and they're called back, they potentially would lose their unemployment. But who knows what's in the current federal law? Maybe they won't lose it. And that's tragic. It really is.
We have an audience from all around the world, literally. I saw somebody is listening, viewing us in Nairobi. What I'd like to do now is turn our attention to some of the questions that have been coming in. And before I do that, I just want to remind our viewers that you can participate by using the Q&A feature or the chat feature, and we'll get that to the folks who are helping us behind the scenes, and they'll articulate your questions. They may group some of the questions if they're similar questions. I want to remind you at the end that there'll be an opportunity to obtain a free book as well. And let me just also to my guests here, the 3 guests, I want to pose a question to you, but I want the answer later because I want you to be thinking about it, and we'll close with your answer. I'd like each of you from your respective fields to state 2 reforms that you would like to see going forward to undo the damage.
We'll do media.
From an economic point of view, from a business point of view, from a legal point of view. And so that will come in, we'll close on that. But right now I'll go to our Acton office and ask if you'd give us some of the questions that have been coming in.
Thank you, Father. Yep, we've been aggregating a few of them. One of the first questions we got this afternoon was on the role of media and how they've been helpful or harmful in this crisis.
Any of you want to?
I would say very harmful in that our local News and Observer, the headline every day is how many people got COVID for the day and how many people died. And I've never seen them report on the flu even once during this period of time or even in the past. So the media has driven this thing as if it were the plague. And they have basically intimidated the populace to think that if you get it, you're probably going to die or your aunt's going to die. So the media is a prime driver of this bad information.
Yeah, and what's going to be very interesting is once the dust settles on this to see how long, in fact, it has been present, and once the numbers shake out, how many people actually survived this who had it and didn't even know they had it. Do we have another question, Charles?
Yeah, the next question is on the role of privacy in this crisis. Do any of you gentlemen have any comments on the technology that's been discussed about contact tracing or other apps and things that governments might be rolling out as a part of the crisis?
Well, I'll mention this. Part of yesterday's headlines had to do with the governor granting to a Democratic operative polling company the contract to do contact tracing in the state. Once it came to light in the media, the contract was canceled. So that's one small time that the media did something good, bringing this sweetheart deal to light. But the danger there, of course, is that under the guise of doing COVID testing, a political operative is getting all kinds of private information about voters, and therefore they can refine their political messaging. And I'm sure that was the intent. So we have to be very careful about this contact tracing business, because it does abrogate privacy to a great extent, and we are relying on goodwill and good faith for these companies to say, well, we won't abuse this information. We know how well that works with Google and Facebook.
I should also mention to those submitting questions, it really helps, it makes it a little more interesting if you tell us where you're located, so that we have an idea of our audience. Charles, another question?
Alex Tokarev, a friend, I believe he's from the Virginia area, asks, what would America's founders do today considering what they did over a minor tax on tea?
It's a good question. We're talking new tea party.
Certainly, I think that the founders would be shocked to see the levels of spending and debt. You know, the size and scope of the government relative to the size of the economy is just enormous. And I think they'd be shocked to see. And whenever you have the government grow like that, there's a natural crowding out effect, right? Where the government goes in and spends money, that's necessarily a dollar that the private sector doesn't have to spend. Or on the other hand, that's a dollar that will then be subsidized by actions of the central bank, which ultimately would lead to inflationary tendencies. And so I think our founders would be quite amazed to see how quickly the government not only grew, especially starting with the Great Depression, but how it's continued to grow in its scope and its intervention into the economy. And as others had mentioned previously, never scales back to the pre-crisis levels. So I think that would be the general perception and observation of the founders, and they'd be pretty shocked by it.
I
Can I
think
add
they
one
would
thing
also
to
be
that?
shocked.
Go ahead.
Bob, go ahead first.
This year, the government's going to spend about 1/3 of the GDP at the federal level. And there's never been a time when the government could collect any more than 18% of the GDP. More recently, most of the time, we don't collect 18%. So we're 2 to 1 out of balance this year. That is very frightening. I would think any senator, Rand Paul recognizes this, but why wouldn't the senator say, this government is so massively overdone, if we do need to spend money, we're going to downsize the government this afternoon. That's how urgent it is.
From
Judge?
a political point of view, I think the founders would be shocked that we have the very federal government that they tried in the Constitution to avoid. That all of the checks and balances and federalism and the Bill of Rights were all designed to check the federal government, and we have a federal government that's essentially unchecked. But on a personal level, I think they would be shocked by the unilateral approach to this problem that we discussed earlier, in that the Revolutionary War was fought during a time of smallpox. And if everybody stayed home so as not to possibly spread the smallpox disease, then we would still be British subjects.
It's a good point. Let me just add to this, though. You say they would be surprised, but the fact of the matter is, all of this regulatory and invasive legislation or decrees or whatever it happens to be did not just come into existence a month ago. This was an apparatus, a legal apparatus, an economic, a statutory apparatus, a regulatory apparatus that existed legally. And now what we're seeing is the extent to which, when it's all brought to bear on a society, what ends up happening, and then, of course, what's going to end up happening down the road with the consequences. I mean, the impact on religious liberty in terms of being told how we can minister and who we can have in our churches is really quite breathtaking. Do we have another question, Charles?
Yes, our friend Marcin in Poland has a question about globalization. As businesses open, what are we anticipating the effects being from other businesses? Let me rephrase. As Americans focus more on American businesses, are we going to see affected activity in Central and Eastern Europe?
Yeah, that's a kind of economist's question, isn't it?
Yes,
what do you think the effects on globalization of trade?
Certainly globalization and free trade has been an enormous engine for improving human flourishing and prosperity across the world. I think the pandemic also shows that with the amplification of those benefits, you also can amplify risks. So when you have epidemics that are not contained and they start to spread across the globe, then you can see, as we're going through right now, what the potential impacts are. I think another thing that you're going to see over time is that given some of the concerns that they have with the supply chain, whether it be through medical supplies that we get or other activities that are now being hampered, I think you're going to see some additional diversification from the sources that individuals use for their supply chains. You may see some individuals say, you know what, we're not so sure that we want to be so dependent upon China. We may go to Vietnam or go to another country. And you might also see this very same behavior in Eastern Europe and other sources. So I think there's an incentive here for businesses to naturally diversify their risk by seeking other supply chains or other alternatives in the event that something like this happens.
Bob, how about your business? Is it global? Are you impacted? Have you benefited from globalization?
Well, we have, in that our primary business is North America, but we buy components all over the world. And the reason is, for example, sheet metal processing equipment primarily comes from northern Italy, some from Germany. That equipment is not made in the US. It's not going to be made in the next 20 years. So that's the only choice. So if you'd say, well, we're going to make it at home, well, guess what? We don't make it at home. And that equipment creates enormous efficiencies and increasing quality. So the idea that we're going to make everything at home, we don't have the talent, the investment, and the environment to make everything at home. Now, as stated, we can relook at our supply chains to make sure that we have diversification, and if the worst happens, we're still okay. That is always going to make sense. But to say that, for example, we buy Italian dampers that are very precise, and that plant is in Milan, and it never stopped running throughout this whole process, not for one single day. Yeah. As a matter of fact, they would keep us informed. We're operating normally. They were allowed to legally operate, and that was a good thing. Had they been shut down, we would have had to go to a lower quality outcome. And when you're talking about precision equipment and electronics, a lower outcome is just not an option. And I think that's what's missed in the idea that we're going to make everything at home. We're better than everything than anybody else is absolutely an absurdity.
That's right. That's right.
Why don't you, Steve, just bring in a definition of autarky, because this is an economic concept a lot of people don't understand, especially with this insistence on America first, buy American first.
Exactly. So autarky is effectively self-reliance from an economic standpoint. So you decide to produce and source and consume everything within your own country or region. And I used to teach economics and tease my students that when individuals run around with campaign slogans saying buy local, make sure you tell them that you're also insisting that they sell only local, right? The natural thing that you actually, when you start to open up trade, you open up trade for both parties and it's mutually beneficial. And if you try to pursue autarky, it's going to end up dramatically decreasing the standard of living across the globe. And I think the difficulty in persuading the average citizen about the benefits of free trade and globalization is that the benefits are very dispersed and relatively invisible, okay? The costs that often accompany it are much smaller but highly visible. So you might see with the increase of trade and the opening up of free exchange globally, you might find a particular industry, a plant shuts down, it's very visible, there's headlines in the newspaper, but what you don't see is a reduction in costs for all these other goods and services that are occurring that impact the ordinary citizen's pocketbook. And in the end, in the aggregate, the summation of all of those financial benefits far exceeds whatever localized and very visible costs that come about as a result of free trade. So autarky would reverse that. We would suddenly see all the things that are currently relatively invisible and widely dispersed. If you went to autarky, you'd see that economic collapse.
Excellent reply. Thank you very much. Charles?
Changing gears here a little bit, we've had several questions on the role of religion in the crisis. Would any of you gentlemen like to comment on how, as Christians, or are we to respond to the crisis?
Well, I guess I'll start with that one. How's that? One of the incredible things that one sees from history is, especially in relation to the Christian disposition, was the fact historically, I'm going back now to the first centuries of Christianity, that it was Christians who were closest to those who were dying, even at risk to themselves. Now, there's a great description of a plague in a book that I really love. It's one of my favorite books by Alessandro Manzoni, I Promessi Sposi. It's translated The Beloved. It's a love story, really, in a way. But there are 3 chapters in this book on the plague, and it talks both about the care, the heroic care that is given to the people who are dying, but also the over-piety and excessive hyper-spirituality of people taking processions through the streets of Milan and spreading the contagion. So it's a very balanced view. And I know that from my pastoral point of view here, we're dealing both with the reality of infection, the reality of the potential of contagion, but also the necessity of pastoral care for people. And I think this is one of the perspectives that I was speaking about earlier, needing to be brought to bear on this. Now, each of you gentlemen are believers. Would you like to address the thing from your own vantage point?
Just one quick comment. If you don't have religious freedom, you don't have any freedom. Religious freedom is the cornerstone of freedom. And now they figured out how to just terminate it with an executive order. That's a very frightening thing.
It concerns me very frankly, the way in which religious leadership has gone along with this too quickly, and even more severely, requiring of churches something even more severe than the government itself or the doctors are asking. Out of what motive, I don't know. Bureaucratic motive, legal responsibility, I'm not sure. On the other hand, there has been religious leadership that has been careless. You saw in the early days of this whole thing erupting, people having church services and encouraging people to embrace one another. One of the pastors actually died from COVID as a result of not taking the necessary precautions. But I think, Bob, you're very right. This is very dangerous to see how quickly they can close down churches.
Our bishops should be chagrined at their lack of courage.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some accounting, some necessary accounting for this later on, because my complaint, and I'll just say it from a Catholic point of view, with regard to the bishops, that I've monitored this nationally, is that the message from the bishops has been no, we're closed down. But on the other hand, what's fascinating to me is the young priests, especially those who are familiar with technology, have really gone out of their way to be very creative, very innovative, you'll pardon the expression, entrepreneurial, in terms of how they're reaching out to people in our own parish. We've had 2 town hall meetings of all of our parishioners on Zoom or Google Meets to talk and pray and be present. We've had classes, we've had even one of our youth leaders had a scavenger hunt online where she was telling the kids who are on, now go find this or go find that, go find a roll of toilet paper. So nobody won that prize, but this kind of a thing that can be done. We'll wait for another question from Charles, if you'll.
The next question is from Jack in Indiana. I was wondering if you gentlemen would comment on the crisis and higher education.
How is this going to transform higher education? Bob, in addition to being an entrepreneur, you're an educator. How do you think this is going to transform education?
I think the cost of higher education is so outrageous. And in too many cases, not only they're not learning anything, they're learning the wrong things. This is going to be a demarcation point, particularly with many of these colleges doing online, which we know is not as good, but that's what they're offering at this same outrageous price. So when the summer comes, I think you're going to see some colleges have told me, not the most prestigious, they may have a 40% drop in enrollment. If that occurs, they're going to be out of business in short order. So this is going to have a major impact and probably a very positive impact on higher education, bringing us back to reality. I always like to throw in this, that I went to LaSalle University in Philadelphia in the 60s for $1,000 a year. And now that cost is $30,000 a year. Many times over inflation. And I would assert that the university is probably not as good as when we went there, because we had really dedicated teachers. It was a whole different time in education. So maybe it'll be a good result for higher education.
I want to kind of bring this to a conclusion. So I asked you gentlemen to give me 2 points of going forward. What recommendations in your varied fields would you recommend? Let's do this as a kind of rapid fire round. So I'll start with Steve Barrows, who's a professor as well.
Sure.
As the director of the Acton Institute.
So it's very broad, but simply speaking, I would make as a reform, reduce the amount of government spending, period. That's more important than focusing on the deficit. Reduce the amount of government spending, period, because like I say, there's a crowding out effect where to the extent that the government gets in and spends money, that's the private sector no longer has those resources at their disposal. So that's the first thing I'd like to see going forward. The second thing I'd like to see going forward is a dismantling of some of the regulatory apparatus that restricts the free flow of price information. Prices are the primary vehicle to send signals to the marketplace about what goods and services are valued and where they should be allocated. And to the extent that the government intervenes and disrupts that process, they disarm the entire market mechanism that has caused so much flourishing in the past with free prices. So those are the 2 things.
Thank you. Thank you. Judge Scoville, what legal things would you propose?
Well, I'm only going to get a 50% on your quiz because I have just one recommendation, and it comes from Lord Acton himself. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we see now, certain governors who have been given unlimited power by the legislature are abusing the power. Actonites should not be surprised by that. And those governors who are not abusing their power, some Southern Republican governors have sort of taken things slowly. They're pilloried by the media for not exercising more power. So I would recommend to legislatures that they look at their emergency powers laws and make the governor accountable to the legislature. So they have to come back in 14 days or 28 days for reauthorization. Even if the legislature is in the same hands, this creates a check on the governor. The whole idea of the American genius of government is compromise. And when you give one person absolute power in any area, they don't have to compromise with anybody, and we see the result. So that would be my one suggestion, to cabin the power of governors.
I'm going to give you.
Yes, thank you.
I'm going to give you full credit on that.
Thank you.
Dutch. Thank
You've
you.
always been merciful.
Bob, close
Major
this out here. What two
downsizing of government
suggestions in terms
at every level, state, federal, national, county, city. And second, elimination of these laws that give governors power and restrict the free market. For example, in North Carolina, you can't build a new hospital bed without approval of the state, which, by the way, you're never going to get, which means the costs are going to continue to accelerate over a period of years. It's grossly unfair to everybody in that state.
is incredible. And what's going to be needed is the combination of all these things, the economic, the legal, the business regulatory questions. We need to start a new movement, really, to overhaul the entire way in which we think about how society coheres. So I want to thank our audience from all over the world for being with us. I want to remind you again, The Entrepreneurial Life by our guest, Bob Luddy. I'm sure you can get that on Amazon and various other outlets. And then if, when you're closing out, you would like a free copy of my monograph, The Entrepreneurial Vocation. We have it available to you in English and in Italian. Just let us know which language you'd like it in. We want to thank our panelists for being with us today. We'll be doing other things like this, so all of you make sure you're on our varied mailing lists so we know how to contact you. And I trust that all of you and your families, your communities, your churches, your businesses are safe and well, and that God will bless each of you abundantly. Thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.